There are a number of skills you'll come away with from this class, and I'm hoping this is one of the main ones that you'll be able to go through and develop and practice. I know you listen. We all listen. We all think that perhaps maybe we're pretty good listeners, just like we think we're all pretty good drivers. We're not. And we're not good listeners either, mainly because we just don't understand what that process might be and how we maybe ought to engage either in active listening or passive listening. And you might think that passive listening is a bad thing, and actually not listening is a bad thing. Passive listening is a different type of listening that we'll get into over the course of this little video as we get into this. So, like perception, listening is a process as well. In fact, it's pretty similar to what the perceptual process is. There's receiving, understanding, remembering, evaluating, and responding. Waiting for this to catch up to me here that way. If we looked at the perceptual process, if you read about that one, it's posted in something that I've written that you need to read. Sensation, organization, interpretation, evaluation. Sensation is the same as receiving. Organization, like understanding. Interpretation, remembering and responding. And then evaluation, same thing that we have going on there. This is a process that we go through very quickly. Maybe we don't even realize that we're engaged in the process. And I'm here to tell you that if we understand the process, and actually while we are listening to somebody, we have this good psychological noise that goes through and says, okay, I'm receiving, I'm trying to understand, you're saying something that you're asking me to remember, and I'm responding to you depending on the kind of listener you need me to be right now. And then I come back with some level of evaluation here, and I hesitate on that one because that one needs to be treated with kid gloves. So let's start with this idea of receiving. In listening, there's that oral process, okay, of listening. If you go through and Google listening, you can come up with all kinds of ears. This is one conglomerate or aggregate picture I thought worked very well for this, because everybody brings something different to the listening table. You do, I do. We have our own frame of reference. We have our own self-concept. And each person here that you see depicted are going to listen differently to the same disclosure that you have. And that's all dependent upon their experience. That's all dependent upon their emotional or relational connection to you. Lots of things come into play here. So receiving isn't just taking those waves of sound that are going around in the air and popping them into our heads via our oral canal in our ears and trying to make some kind of sense of that. When we're receiving something, we're receiving it with filters. We're receiving it with the menu of our experience as well. Before we go on to the next level, okay? All kinds of things that are happening within that. And the next level is this concept of understanding. And this is an interesting word in English because we have comprehension, maybe understanding, and in terms of a synonym to that. In French, my other language, there's a cognate, comprendre, which means to comprehend. But it's a false cognate to understanding. If you looked up the word understanding in French, you would come up with this word, soutien. And that literally means to under, soutien, stand, to support, okay? So it's pretty critical to have a comprehension of what's going on. I'm not sure we're completely capable of that because of that whole empathy idea. In meaning that we can strive for empathy, but we're not actually going to reach empathy. Okay, and I'll come back to that one here in just a minute. But to understand, to support somebody in listening, is to go through and say, regardless of what you say right now, you're going to have my attention, and I'm going to attend you. I'm going to listen to what's going on. So I really like that. Definition of understanding. And we might have terms we don't understand, we don't comprehend, and we might need to seek some level of clarification that way. The next idea is that of remembering. And this becomes problematic because women remember differently than men. Because of that content relational thing, women have better memory because they make relationships with the content of those disclosures of that conversation. They make relationships with them. And as a result, they remember it better. Men categorize them for the most part. Again, I'm speaking in very broad generalizations, but for the intent of you understanding this, we need to realize that in terms of gender, my being male, my spouse is being female, I need to realize that we're coming together from two entirely different methods of remembering conversations, remember things that we have going on. And she knows that I don't have a great memory, and I know that I don't have a great memory, and I'm trying to go through and make better relationships. I'm trying to be more relational with her, while she doesn't need to be content oriented, because that doesn't really lend itself to going through and remembering. Remembering is an indication that you are listening, or that you have been listening. And that's why it's critical within the process. Right after receiving, the next thing we need to do is to start indexing what it is that we're talking about, so we can come back and remembering. Indexing is making that relationship with the ideas that are being expressed. Responding is next, and here's where we get into the two modes, if you will, of listening: active listening and passive listening. Active listening, let me tackle that one first off, then I'll get into passive listening. These are not diametrically opposed to each other, okay? You need to understand that. There is a common mistaken idea that passive listening is not really listening, and not really listening is not really listening. Okay, I'll come back to that here in just a minute. So active listening is where we are engaged non-verbally, okay? We're making eye contact. We might open that tactile channel through touch. Even our own spatial or proxemics might be close together, okay, which goes through and indicates that we are engaged with them non-verbally. Now, we don't have to, if that's not the nature of the relationship, we can still show our engagement by making eye contact, by nodding our head and putting out some type of nonverbal illustrator or regulator that goes through and says that we understand, or that we agree, or that I'm hoping that you will continue going on with that, okay? Active listening also includes a verbal response when it's appropriate. We don't want to interrupt. We'll come back to that here in a minute. We don't want to interject. We want to allow that disclosure to come to its conclusion before we go through and seek clarification or add our 2 cents into what's going on. The passive listener does all of that nonverbal stuff, okay? They maintain eye contact. Depending on their relationship, they open that tactile channel. They decrease the proximity there. Basically, they do this one thing. They attend. But they don't do it verbally, okay? They listen, they let it wash over them, and then when the person has finished their disclosure, they even wait at that point to see if there's anything else that can come out of that. In my experience with listening, with passive listening, especially involved in a situation where I need to get some intelligence, the best thing I've ever done was not do anything, was to just continue to listen and wait and see. So after the person goes through and discloses, I will continue making eye contact. It might get a little uncomfortable. But then usually after that point, that's when the jewels come. That's when the real stuff starts to happen that way. And that sounds manipulative, and I don't mean to be in terms of just interpersonal communication here. These two styles address two very specific channels of communication in terms of listening. The active listener deals with somebody who is not escalated. They deal with somebody where we're on equal footing in terms of this quid pro quo exchange, this tit-for-tat exchange happening within the conversation. Where I talk about an experience that reminds you of an experience, and so you talk about that one, and we're just going along. And active listening works really well. Passive listening works better in escalated situations. So if you're dealing with somebody who's angry at you, or angry at the world, or they're upset, they're sad, they're emotional, it's better to be a passive listener. Now, chances are we might naturally gravitate one side or the other depending on the situation you get into. Maybe you have an instinct, and some people do have this listening instinct to say, I better just shut up right now and listen to what it is that you have to say. A lot of that just comes with wisdom. It comes with the different experiences or relationships that you might be in. I'm here to tell you that you need to start understanding when it's appropriate to be active and when you should be passive in terms of what you're listening with it, because it's going to improve your relationship. Try it. Try it tonight. Try it with your significant other, with your whoever's close to you, your spouse or your boyfriend, girlfriend, your parent, your sibling, your roommate. Try it and see. And see if they don't notice a difference in how you approach them and how you listen to them. Like any skill, this comes about with some practice, okay? With a lot of practice, actually, with a lifetime worth of practice there. The last rung here, the last item in the process is evaluating. And this is tough because really you want to stave this one off as long as you possibly can, because as soon as we have evaluated somebody, we have lost our ability to be empathic with them. And that's one of the listening styles I'm going to get into here. There are 4 listening styles that have to do with this idea of evaluating. The first one is feigned listening. This is a new word for you. You can use this in a sentence later on and impress somebody maybe, but it means you're faking it. And we've all faked it on some level. And sometimes this is very pragmatic for us to go through and pretend to be listening to somebody. But more often than not, we have some psychological noise going on in our head, and what this person is yammering along about to us is not interesting to us at all, or maybe they just need to have a warm body near them, or whatever the case might be, but we're faking it. And I'm not going to give any more attention really to that one. The next one is the listening style is empathic listening. Now, these styles, except for the feigned one, go to either the active listening or the passive listening, okay? We can be actively empathic, or we can be passively empathetic. Boy, I can't talk today. Empathic or empathetic, as the case might be. The next one is non-judgmental listening style, and the last one is critical listening. Let's start with empathic listening. This is probably the purest form of listening because we are really attempting to try to understand where this individual is coming from. We are proxies. They're within their disclosure, within their story. Now, you can't, okay? You can't reach that perfect empathy because you don't have that individual's experience and they don't have yours, but we can try to be that proxy. And in doing so, we're going to be a little vulnerable. If we're willing to wade into those waters there, then we become vulnerable maybe to the same harms or effects that they have been experiencing that they're telling you about, okay? The empathic listener attends. They know when to be active, they know when to be passive, and use those skills to go through and garner as much information from this individual as they can. And they do so by not interrupting. I think I've said this twice now in this, maybe another time in another presentation. Interrupting somebody is going to go through and terminate the listening process. I might have said this before in this video, but it bears repeating. If you interrupt somebody, you're demonstrating 2 things: that what they have to say is not as important as what you have to say, and that you weren't listening to them to begin with in order to come up with what you have to say in order to step all over them while they're trying to go through and disclose. So interruption really is it's the carcinogen to this idea of empathic listening. With that vulnerability, there's going to be some risk involved within that as well. And that risk that you take to go through and say, I'm ready to listen to you, is also indicative of perhaps the love that you have for that individual, for what's going on. My wife knows, and I know as well, of the risks involved in our disclosures to each other. And we take those risks because we know we love each other, and we know that there's not going to be an evaluation attached to whatever is going to be disclosed there. Critical listening. We all go to somebody who we might feel is a critical listener. I have a close colleague of mine that I will bounce ideas off of because they're objective. They have the ability to go through and listen to what it is that I'm saying and then come back to me and say, well, here's the pros and here's the cons. My spouse is a great critical listener. Uh, Again, these listening styles change according to what it is that we're doing. So in a content type of situation where like we're buying a house right now, okay, and as we go through and talk about different financing or different remodels or whatever we're doing, we're very critical in listening to each other. We're trying to be objective. We're trying to be neutral and allow all the ideas to be shared out there. We clarify and look for terms that we might not be, we might not have the same agreement on. And so we clarify those to make sure that we're all on the same page. When I'm critically listening, it might be to one of my kids, it might be to a student. I'll take notes. There are not a lot of words. I'm not, doing shorthand or anything. I'm just writing maybe down a word or two at a time, so I don't have to interrupt them to come back and seek clarification, and I don't have to rely on my memory. I can go back to my notes and say, okay, now a few minutes ago you had indicated that, and then I read the one word that I've written down, and I'm able to respond to them. Okay, so the notes go through and help me become more neutral and more objective in doing so. I need to know what my biases are. And I need to check my biases as I might be listening to you and your recitation of your biases, especially if we're getting political or we're getting religious or whatever. I cannot be critical if I have judged you. And then the critical listener has the ability to provide feedback. That's the reason why we're going to them. I want to know how you feel. I want to know what you think. I want to know what your opinion is. I'm seeking this out because you're a critical listener, or that's been sought out of you, right? So this becomes really a big part of that. And it's the last, in terms of responding within the listening process, this is where it becomes critical. The last listening style is non-judgmental listening. And again, you might be, or you might seek out somebody who is non-judgmental because we're going to them with maybe some kind of a discrete disclosure. I've done something, I don't want you to judge me, so I'm going to go to you to be able to get it out there, okay? Psychotherapists are great non-judgmental listeners, okay? And the reason why they're getting paid the bucks is to go through and sit and stop their evaluative process while the disclosure happens, okay? Again, we can't interrupt. The non-judgmental, this is a passive listening style, okay? It's really not that active listening. And as a result, we're not going to go through and interrupt. We're not going to interrupt both verbally, and we're not going to interrupt non-verbally as well, okay? Probably to be as stoic as we can is one of the best approaches here. The non-judgmental person doesn't rush to any kind of conclusions, and I'll tell you why. Even though we might be silent in our listening and we might go through and try to control our emotions and what our face is expressing, as soon as we go to a conclusion, we might express that surprise or that contempt or that anger in a micro expression and not have any control over that. So we need to stay open-minded throughout the disclosure and try to not allow our faces to express the shock or the surprise or whatever of the disclosure of what's going on. That's really, really hard to do. This takes some practice to go through and do that. And some on a professional level will tell you that happens over the course of years and not just a couple of weeks in a semester. That's hard. As an interrogator, I have to do the same thing. When I'm listening to somebody go through and give us a deposition, I cannot register any emotion on my face. If I know they're lying, I can't register that. If they start sobbing, it sounds heartless, but I can't empathize at that point. I can't go through and disturb the context of the disclosure of what's going on. Otherwise, if I do have a judgment, then that empowers them or it disables them in terms of their disclosure in what's happening. As such, not only do I have to check what's happening with my face, I have to check any kind of distortions that might be going on. What I mean by this is Somebody might be disclosing that they got drunk at a party, and you're going through and trying to visualize the context in which that happened, and you start distorting that. Well, did she get hit on then while she was drunk? Did they end up in a bedroom? We start adding to the story, and you can't do that. It's their story. They're writing it for you in their disclosure as they're putting it out to you. It's not your job to edit it, and it's not your job to embellish it. And by doing so, we're distorting the story. So we need to check and make sure that our own assumptions aren't playing into what it is that we're understanding about their disclosure. So that's the process: receiving, understanding, remembering, responding, and evaluating. Actually, it's evaluating and responding. That's okay. The process is still there. But the question here, in terms of that listening process, is who's your favorite listener? That'll be the discussion topic for this week. Make sure you find the thread and reply. And tell us why. Why is this person your favorite listener? You don't have to name them. You can do it by relationship or whatever, but be interesting to know. Okay.